Well, next I would like to invite Lara Clark from the American Library Association Office of Information Technology Policy here in DC. It is, yeah. Who will share a few of the high-level findings from a soon-to-be-released report highlighting some of the impacts of the BTOP program on libraries.
You know, I'm not a Mac user.
Oh, here, I can help really quick.
Can you pull?
Yeah.
How do you do it?
Well, it's a hard transition from Mac to PC.
It is a hard transition from Mac to PC. Thank you.
All right.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure. Oh, good, it wasn't me. It's my pleasure to be here with you this morning. Again, my name is Lara Clark. I work in the ALA Office for Information Technology Policy. We're the policy arm of the American Library Association here in Washington, D.C. Our headquarters are in Chicago. And I was able to visit last year as well, so I'm glad to be back. I'm still learning about the K-20 community and the work that is happening here, so I'm glad I'll be able to stay all day. And I'd welcome people to ask me questions or to tell me about what you're doing and how libraries can be better engaged. Again, particularly in the public library sphere, but also ALA represents school libraries, so if you have anything to say about them, I'd be happy to hear that too. So we have been working on this report for a little while, and as James knows, I've been furiously editing it, and I'd hoped to bring a copy with me. It's about 32 pages at this point, but it's not quite done. I'm hoping that we'll have it in the next week or so and be able to share it by the list for folks that are interested in reading it in all of its detail. But just for a few things to get started. This is something we've been talking about for a long time. We started this project in February in detail, trying to really grab information from the NTIA database and the program officers after the Brookings Institute did a BTOP program, and there wasn't very much mention of libraries. And so we wanted to make sure that wasn't because the ALA hadn't done its job in providing information about the work that had been done in libraries and the impacts on the communities that we serve. So our goal was really to share some of this information. It's not, I wouldn't say it's a comprehensive report. We didn't do original research as far as interviewing people about how did they do what they did. So you folks may say, well, how did that happen? And I can't say that I know the answers to those questions yet, but I'd be curious at the end of the program, questions that you have for me and also questions that you might have around additional information that would be helpful for you as we look at what else we might be doing in the future. I think we've been the most successful in making sure that we gathered statewide projects. We have documented projects in about 29 states and the District of Columbia, and the vast majority of these that we were looking at were statewide impacts coordinated through the State Library Agency. And I'll give a little bit of detail about what that looks like. And we brought it up to date as of December 2012. And again, primarily using the NTIA database of information, and then also following up with local libraries and state library agencies. So here's a little bit more about kind of what we found. We found it really difficult extracting the information out of the database unless it was a state library agency project where they really drilled down into what they were doing. And that was true for about 24 of the projects. But there are many, particularly the infrastructure grant programs that are connecting community anchor institutions like libraries, where it's not so easy to kind of say, who it's connected, at what speeds, how did it happen, at least at that granular level of detail. So I'll say that we did not have the level of information around the CCI projects as I would have liked, which may be a particular interest here, and I would love to hear from people in this room who may have been involved with BTOP projects, even tangentially supporting schools and libraries and connecting additional anchor institutions. We know that's part of the work that's happening with USUCAN, but if there are examples that you have, I would love to hear them because it was very difficult for us to do this, and we know there's a lot more out there that we couldn't capture. We also grabbed a few videos. It's one of the things that we have a hard time doing is telling our story sometimes and why this matters. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation did some videos kind of talking about why broadband matters through libraries. So we've kind of tried to pull all of those together. So if somebody needs to do a presentation or tell a story about why this matters, they can do it more easily. So after talking with the NTIA program officers and hearing from state library staff, we kind of focused in 4 main areas to kind of bring forward the space where we thought libraries had brought the most value with this program. I think after spending some time with the report, I would add education if I had it to do again, and we might do a separate build out because I think some of the educational partnerships that were created are really important and hopefully will be long lasting. And I'll circle back with that a little bit later. So here's a little update. When we were here last year, we talked a little bit about what do we know about public library connectivity and infrastructure. So this is a little bit of an update from the Public Library Funding and Technology Access Study about kind of the state of the union, if you will, as far as hardware and connectivity. Some of this increase, and we also can't break out what about this, particularly the 1/3 of libraries that have really ramped up beyond 10 megabits per second, which I know is kind of small for you guys, but it makes a big difference for us in our public libraries. But we couldn't separate out what was specifically attributable to BTOP and what was other things that were already underway. So just to keep my caveats going as we move along through the report. You know, I don't think that anybody would be surprised by the increase in the number of computers because basically with the financial situation that libraries are facing, whenever there's a new pot of money, it often goes to increasing the capacity. And what we found is that a majority of libraries have had flat or decreasing budgets over the last year, and about 13% of libraries were unable to maintain their replacement cycles. So things like this Michigan State University grant bringing 2,400 new or updated computers. I mean, there were some massive investments in states. Probably most of the grants were public computer center grants, and they brought a huge infusion. In Alabama, for instance, they talked about having 10-year-old computers that were crashing. So it wasn't even the network. The hardware couldn't support modern applications that they were trying to run. Is anyone here from Nebraska by any chance? Oh, I'd love to talk with you a little later, perhaps. Nebraska was one of the stories that I found the most interesting. Nebraska libraries, 77% of Nebraska libraries serve communities smaller than 2,500 people, which is, I mean, you think about it, 50% of their libraries serve communities smaller than 1,000 people. So when you think about what technology can do to connect those kind of remote rural locations and the fact that their libraries, that this may be the one spot where they can get access to these resources, I was just so impressed by the level of upgrade. And I don't know how they did it. You know, do they start with new partnerships? Do they connect with the R&E? Or is there an opportunity to do that in the future? The Oklahoma libraries, and we saw this in other states as well. We had big leaps forward in connectivity in Alaska, Oklahoma, Delaware, and Montana. The Montgomery County Library in California went from 1.5 megs to 10. DC went from 10 to 1 gig. Louisville went from a shared 100 megs network to 650 for its 18 branches. And Alaska improved its bandwidth for 67 libraries who had no broadband at all, to at least support 1.5 symmetrical. And speaking of the distance learning, I'm very excited about the fact that video conferencing is statewide in at least 5 states now. And we see this in larger cities, of course, where that's happening, but we're seeing statewide applications as well. The workforce stuff, I think, is fairly straightforward, at least for our community. This has been in place since the recession started, where we've started to see these kind of partnerships, particularly with one-stops and departments of labor and other community organizations. Some of them are using their video conferencing to support workforce needs around like distance interviews and interactive testing to support some of these workforce needs and job retraining. Another major area is digital literacy. While this doesn't have as much of a bandwidth impact, I think, it's been really, really important for libraries. And I think is a complement to what's happening in the K through 12 environment. For people who are not in the school setting, the libraries are really vital for helping them get up to speed on what they're going to need to be doing in the digital age, particularly just starting with filing an online application, which is kind of where a lot of people start when they come to our libraries. There is some interactive tutorial programs that we know that libraries waited until they had the adequate bandwidth to support those kinds of interactive applications. And one of the things that I found interesting is that the NTIA's Angela Simpson recently noted at a broadband conference a couple weeks ago that the New York City computing centers report that multimedia classes that people need for workplace uses are the classes in greatest demand, which I think is a little surprising and shows, I think, the change that we've seen over the last couple of years. There's still plenty of people coming in for really basic, everything from a mouse to attaching files, but that there's a continuum, and it's a growing continuum about what people expect to do, and we're seeing this in our digital media labs, and that increasing need for synchronous connections and the ability to upload and download with the same kind of robustness, which I think is also very relevant here and is part of the value proposition that you have for libraries. So the last area where we really focused, and I think this is perhaps one of even the most transformative, particularly if it's long-standing, is the partnerships that have been created. It was encouraged by the BTOP program. I'd love to see more programs that require or preference this kind of collaborative work between community anchor institutions and other state and local government agencies and community-based agencies. So we saw the entire gamut. I think a lot of work, particularly with K through 12 and higher education, was very common, particularly as it related to digital literacy. The Internet Interns program in that state actually brought students from the college to provide digital literacy through the library. So it added the human resource capacity in the library, and it also brought service learning for the students. And it brought a lot of value to the library patrons in Vermont. The Volunteer Lawyers Project, I think, is very interesting because it uses the video conferencing in this way to connect rural remote in ways that are really life essential, which is connecting them with, similar to telemedicine, with people who are trained professionals that do not live in their communities of 1,000 or fewer people, and making sure they get access to lawyers to ask questions around any nature of things that you can imagine that you would need a lawyer for. So that's an entirely new opportunity. And one of the other things, an example of this collaboration within the higher education community is in Oklahoma. One of the libraries offering a public administration degree for education in partnership with a local university using its new video conferencing equipment. 16 students are attending a class at the Pryor Public Library, which is saving them their travel time and money to get to the actual higher education location. So here's some of the things that I'm trying to write up in the conclusion. One of the things that people say in the library community is if you've seen one library, you've seen one library. We saw this in the types of grants. There were some common areas certainly around adding capacity with hardware and bandwidth improvements, but how they approached it and who they partnered with and the community value that they were seeking to inform varied quite a lot from project to project. Several of them did talk about the value of standardizing equipment and processes across libraries in their state, and I think the cost effectiveness and the efficiency of that was something that several people called out, so there is hopefully some greater standardization that is coming up. I think one of the other things is just the mobile piece of this. I think we were at about 90% wireless access a couple of years ago, and I think we're probably at 100% now. And libraries, people are using that in the community, in the parking lot, but they're also bringing their own devices. So students leaving from the K through 12 environment are walking across the street and going to the public library with their devices, around 2:30, which, kills our network. And I'm very interested in seeing if there are ways to share networks and look to if there is a way to transfer, as students leave, where more bandwidth becomes available, where there's a shared network. I understand that's not as easy as I would like it to be. But I think this mobile aspect is going to be increasingly important. And it also means that library services are not just in the library. Not only are people hitting our websites and accessing things like Susan was talking about around online resources, although much less robust than what she was talking about. But they're also going out into the community and using mobile broadband to, on tech mobiles and mobile laptop labs, and going into much more isolated and removed community areas where they may not otherwise have access to the library services. The bottom line of all of this is that, this has probably touched about 20% of libraries in the country, where we've seen these kind of improvements, and we're also going to need to replace and update again within the next 3 to 5 years. So there's a lot more work to be done, and there's more research that's probably needed to do to look at how the sustainability plays out. Most of these projects are wrapping up now, so what does that look like as far as the next step? So we're going to publish this, like I said, probably around May 1st, and it'll be available on our website. And I would be interested to hear from folks about your experiences through BTOP, if you had any that you'd like to share, particularly that related to libraries, and any questions that you might have for me related to the report that I may be able to answer or that I can get back to you on.
Go ahead, Larry. Let me give you the microphone.
Could you just spend a minute or two talking about the full report and what kind of information can be found there? I'm curious to know if there's state-by-state information available.
Yes, there is. The report is organized by state. In California, for instance, there wasn't a statewide project, but there were several large programs at the city level, so we tried to capture those as best we could. But all of the statewide projects are in there. For the CCIs, we have Massachusetts and Washington, for instance, and then all of the other programs. So what we did is we provided some overall summary about what's happened as of December 2012, what kinds of upgrades and improvements have been made in the infrastructure, and what kinds of programs have been offered as a result of the investment. And then, again, trying to talk a little bit about the impact. It's pretty granular and anecdotal at this point because we didn't have a major research team looking at this. There's a whole other project that's happening with ASR Analytics that was funded by NTIA to really look at community-based impacts. So there's a little bit of that, but trying to share stories about what this has meant for individual members of the community or what it's enabled. So there is state-level summary information for all the states that had statewide projects, as well as large local projects wherever we could, like Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Louisville, Kentucky. And if you're aware of a project that we didn't include, then we're also looking to add that. We didn't hear back from some people we reached out to, say in Texas. Brownsville and El Paso had large projects, for instance, that the libraries were involved with, but we didn't get the detail back from the local people. Was that helpful? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else have a question for Lara? I certainly have a couple. All right. Well, I wondered if you might, you'd mentioned 5 statewide deployments of video conferencing across the country. I wonder if you might spend just a couple minutes sort of describing a few of those and what they're doing. I think you had alluded to one of them.
In Oklahoma.
Yeah, in Oklahoma.
The OK Connect project. Yeah. Oklahoma, Alaska, Maine, Delaware, and Rhode Island all reported having statewide video conferencing projects. We have the most information from their reports from Maine, Alaska, and Oklahoma. There are 33 libraries, so it's not every library that's connected in Oklahoma. 33 libraries were connected. In Alaska, it was far more ambitious. I mean, they looked to connect all of the libraries in a state where they did not have 1.5 megabits. They did not have a T1 line, and yet they were looking to do statewide video conferencing. And I think they've reached that. I don't know what that experience looks like for some of the very smallest libraries, but for instance, it's enabled them to connect the Alaska Humanities Council, so folks around the state have a board meeting, and they would spend about $16,000 to travel to a location in Alaska to meet for 4 hours. The video conferencing capability took away that need. They all went to their libraries and they were hooked in through the video conferencing, which is also supported by the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, I believe. And they've also done Pitchapalooza with, where aspiring authors can connect with book reviews and editors and get feedback and perhaps make a deal. And also children's story time, those kinds of things. And then the main program, as I mentioned, is one of the hallmarks of theirs is the volunteer lawyers program, which has just started. Yeah. Judy?
Judy Graves from Library of Congress has a comment or a question.
Lara, the tiny library in Craig, Alaska,
Yes.
connected with us already for 2 video conference programs.
Yeah.
We'll be doing one on Thursday with them on how to do interviews for an oral history project
That's
they planned.
fantastic.
So, and they were connected with multiple sites.
Yeah.
This is about a 4-point connection for previous conferences. So Alaska is going great guns.
It's incredible.
But they've connected with us for programs that I know are of interest to the public. But in your research of the programs that you found, have you been able to draw conclusions about the kinds of programs of interest to the libraries out there?
And are you talking about for the public and or for the internal library staff or kind of capacity?
All
like
of the above. Speaking as a person who provides content programming, I'm interested in finding out if there's a way for me to know what kinds of programs I might think about developing for this new group.
It's something that I would say that the report doesn't currently have a lot of detail about that other than the ones I've mentioned. These are some very clear examples. I think it may be an area where we want to do more. I mean, one of the things that we're kind of gearing up for is another proceeding around the E-rate program. And one of the questions that we've been asked is what are we expecting for the next 10 to 20 years for library services? And I believe that video conferencing is part of that vision and why we need higher capacity, because it does support, and we know this already, it does support training similar to what I described for Alaska, where it allows libraries to connect across the state. And I think we saw this in Missouri with MoreNet, where people do library training, they do virtual connections across the state for the state library agency to support library development. So there is that element of it. But I think you're right that what people are interested in, and they're still learning, and I think it's that connection, which is why I'm looking forward to your presentation, is what's possible, because this is for folks in schools. You all have been doing this for a long time, and it's still a pretty brave new world for us. And what does it enable? So I would say that you're probably a step ahead of us on that. And it may be something that we actually can do some more direct drill down on this, because I think it will be important for showing what's possible in our libraries. And when I hear people this morning talking about this, I can think of like how the Smithsonian program might work in our libraries, for instance. So I think part of that job, honestly, is educating people about what's possible. So that's part of the reason why I'm here, is to share that with our memberships, that I think they're still getting their feet wet in this area, and they can learn a lot from all of you.
We're fortunate to have Steve Smith, formerly of University of Alaska Systems, who worked for years in connecting community anchors to the network there. So I asked Steve if he might just say a few words on what he knows in terms of how libraries in Alaska are being connected to internet too, as well as.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, you should be on.
Well, I'll just shout because my mic doesn't seem to be on. I haven't been in Alaska for about a year. I'm in Hawaii now. So you can see for obvious reasons why I've changed addresses. But actually, I was very involved with this in Alaska as we got the the money to put this together. And it has been a real challenge, as was pointed out. There are a lot of places that didn't even have a T1 circuit, and a lot of Alaska is still served by satellite.
Yes.
But the important thing that this has done, and the aspiration that we had in Alaska to get video conferencing into every library, this has played a significant role in building out the infrastructure and at an affordable rate for all of those smaller communities in the state. And particularly in Alaska, libraries are a critical community institution that acts as a central location for folks to get their broadband connectivity. So this has played a significant role in building out broadband across the state. So this is exactly where I think the community access programs was the intent to play them out like that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. No, my. Oh, there we are. Thanks a lot, Steve. All right. Well, any last questions for Lara before we? Oh, we're just not going to let you go.
Do you plan at all on doing like a follow-up report? Because in some ways, I think this report is somewhat premature. I know, like in Vermont, you know, we're just getting some of these libraries connected, and
Yeah.
we're applying to like other grants to kind of build off
Yes.
of this as well. So even though you know, we didn't use a BTOP video conferencing, we ended up getting a Google grant for video conferencing, and so
Yeah.
putting some equipment in that way, and you know, using it as impetus for the libraries to finally join the SEGP network. And
Right.
so there's a lot of things that this really put into action that aren't going to happen for a couple of years. Is there going to, are you going to look at some of these follow-on effects at all?
Yeah, I mean, that's my hope. I would say that this was something, just getting to where we are now was something we talked about almost from the beginning of the program, is how would we capture this information, and we kind of put it off because we thought it would be hard, and it was hard, is how do you get the correct information both out of NTIA and out of all the players at the state and local levels. So I believe that's exactly true. I mean, people are really just wrapping up, and we've heard stories like Vermont's where, or in Alaska, they're looking to, they've sought additional funding from the legislature for sustainability. So what are the sustainability lessons, and what does this leverage or enable? I mean, that's really that's the story that's most important. But again, for us, it was about kind of an interim check-in, because NTIA is actively promoting this program because they want people to understand that this was $7 billion that was well invested through NTIA and RUS. So we wanted to be part of that story, but I think you're absolutely right that this is not the final word on this, and I would encourage people to tell me what you're looking for. I mean, I think video conferencing and the education connections is something that I'm particularly interested in, and I think there is going to be more to tell about kind of hopefully what does this leverage, and that's going to be the most important story. So I hope that there will be additional information. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. Join me in thanking Larry.